It's the beginning of a new month, and that means it is time for your piping hot monthly Bitcoin digest. We have got a ton on the docket to cover today. Everything from macro to adoption news, some different Bitcoin technology highlights, and lastly, some troubling revelations from the regulatory front. Without further ado, let's jump in. This video is made possible by Bitcoin trading cards, and I am pumped to have them as the first sponsor on my channel. I met Aladdin and the team back at Pacific Bitcoin 2022, and I'm not gonna lie, at the time I thought, okay, cool, a quirky little Bitcoin project, but little could I have imagined at the time how this project would capture imaginations. I've personally used these to orange pill people that I care about in my life. The art is stunning and features Bitcoin artists all around the world. You get high quality Bitcoin education on topics like economics and freedom as part of that, which makes this, as you can imagine, a really special project for me. And I'm not gonna lie, it makes you want to collect these. The community behind this is also truly insane. And I think they have a real shot at bringing Bitcoin to the mainstream. So if you're curious to check them out, head over to btc-tc.com where you can find the different series they've launched. And hey, if you do end up snagging some cards, you'll also get some Bitcoin rewards back on your purchase, powered by Jolts. Here's to ripping packs and stacking sats. All right, so on the more sort of macro side of things, lots of interesting things happening. Of course, one of the headliners being that the Fed in the US took rates down by 50 basis points, 0.5%. And while that was expected by market participants, it was still nonetheless notable. The very first rate easing in close to 4 years. And as we can see, markets are also predicting and pricing in an additional 200 bips or 2 additional percentage points over the next 12 months. So markets are predicting a rather quick rate cut path. And let's remember that central banks have already been doing this other than the Fed. We can see this interesting post. This was actually back in the summer, but as it indicated at the time, close to half, so about 42% of central banks were already easing back in the summer. We can see that 80% expect to ease by the end of the year. But as I and others have covered many times, arguably the even more important thing than rates, right? Because falling rates is always a lagging response from regulators in response to economic weakness. And there's tons of that going around. Snyder does a great job on his channel identifying some of that. But the point is, assets like Bitcoin don't always do well immediately following a rate cut, given what that typically means. It's typically a response to economic weakness and is not, oh, we can sort of relax things now because inflation is coming down to our target rate, which is what they would have you believe. What's even more important than that, at least for Bitcoin, is liquidity. And lo and behold, what do we see? We can see first and foremost, US M2 growth is actually accelerating after flipping positive in 2024 after being negative across 2023. And that was the first time, I think, since the Great Depression that, M2 had compressed at that sort of rate. So that crossover of this coming back positive, that's a significant signal. Furthermore, global M2 has just hit a new all-time high, which is crazy, right? It feels like we were just in this kind of tightening sort of phase, and that's rapidly getting unraveled. And indeed, if we look at these two things, so here is Bitcoin year-on-year change, obviously very volatile, versus global M2 year-on-year change. And as you can see, they are quite correlated, at least in the directional sense in terms of these cycles, right? Like that is a really, really important and powerful chart. To build on that, Lynn Alden recently commissioned this study called Bitcoin, a Global Liquidity Barometer, where they basically quantified the degree to which Bitcoin is correlated with global liquidity. And I think what they found was that in terms of pure correlation with like year-on-year change, there's actually other things like the S&P that are even more correlated than Bitcoin. However, when looking at this sort of like directional alignment, as they're calling it, Bitcoin is actually the top asset class and moves in the direction of global liquidity 83% of the time in any given 12-month period. So that also helps crystallize how important that fact is that we are now going into the uptrend when it comes to global liquidity. So like, can you predict what happens next? Obviously, we have the looming US election. Historically speaking, regardless of which party wins, the resolution of that uncertainty is typically very good for Bitcoin. Obviously, have the recent news coming out of the Middle East and continued escalation of tensions there. So make no mistake, like the next month may not be very much October-y, which, you know, historically has been quite a good month for Bitcoin. And so potentially another lesson in humility that, you know, the past certainly does not indicate what will happen now or in the future. But liquidity moving in that overall direction, you now have much more accessibility for that liquidity and capital to flow into Bitcoin in one way, shape, or another, not just through the ETFs, but we also, of course, just saw that the SEC has now approved options trading on BlackRock's IBIT ETF. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of why that's such a big deal. British Hodl has a really good thread and posts on it if you look him up on X. And there are others that have talked about why this is such a big deal. But the punchline is just that. It is a big deal. And in a very incremental way versus just having the ETF products, going to make Bitcoin a lot more accessible to institutional capital, etc. Which, of course, I'm not suggesting is a good thing for the self-sovereignty of the average citizen, but I do think it's going to be good for number go up, right? That is just fundamentally different than past cycles. You just have not had that degree of access. And so as liquidity comes and sloshes about, as price really starts to run, you just have many more ways that that feedback loop can feed on itself. Additionally, in other news, after perhaps a fairly long snooze after El Salvador came out and made Bitcoin legal tender, some out there may say, well, there you go, right? Geopolitical game theory, not really a thing. Where's everyone else? But again, keep in mind, this takes time. We've seen some interesting meetings between Bukele in El Salvador and Milei in Argentina. There have been some interesting posts on X there. And reports are that as part of, you know, broader discussions, Bitcoin and what El Salvador has done there is being discussed. But even more powerful, let's look at like real world examples. The Kingdom of Bhutan was revealed to have now mined 13,000 Bitcoin using its excess geothermal power. It's now the 5th biggest country level holder of Bitcoin in the world. Its Bitcoin holdings are a third of its GDP. And while some of us may find what I'm about to say good or bad, they used some of this to finance a 50% pay increase for its civil servants. So Kingdom of Bhutan has just been like quietly mining Bitcoin with its hydropower for the last 4 years. And so every other country in a similar position has to look at that and be like, why are we not doing this? Suriname also has this candidate, Maya Parbo. Some of you may have seen her on X. If you think El Salvador has done things right, if you think Argentina is doing anything right, I think Maya is going just to a different galaxy, right? She's talking about bringing on Hans to help enact radical reforms, abolishing all taxes, dismantling the central bank, making Bitcoin the official unit of account. Now, you may say, okay, well, that's just a bunch of rhetoric from a would-be politician. But if you follow Maya on X, you will, I think, inescapably conclude that she is a true Bitcoin pleb through and through. Now, whether she gets elected, who on earth knows? But some interesting stuff, and you're starting to really see these examples of countries bucking these sort of like inevitable descent into more and more socialist BS, which is what we see happening with the West. So it's going to be very interesting to see how some of this shakes out. And so where are we in the cycle? Keep in mind that historically speaking, Bitcoin typically peaks in its fiat exchange rate about 500 to 550 or so days following the halving, which of course we had in April of this year. There's some recent research from CoinMarketCap suggesting we're ahead of schedule. Who knows whether that's true or not, but that pegs us somewhere in 2025, which I have long been saying across this year is going to be when we really see the fireworks, maybe starting a little bit earlier in Q4 of this year following the election, provided that we don't see any kind of like big additional black swans of, you know, World War III and all this sort of stuff. So I personally think these different pieces are coming together, and
I think we're going to see this assumption around diminishing returns, right? Every cycle we should see diminishing returns. I think we're going to see that violated this cycle, and I think it's going to absolutely break all the critics' brains, both within other crypto ecosystems who come and shit on Bitcoin and outside of it. I think it's just going to be crazy. But that's my prediction. Curious what you think. Let me know in the comments down below. It's also extremely exciting to continue to see the sheer pace of development and developers coming back to Bitcoin, building new and interesting things on Bitcoin. We had Bolt 12 officially added to the Bolt standards. These are the standards that comprise and codify the Lightning Network. I did a whole video on Bolt 12 way back in the day when it was being discussed. And so that being merged in is a very exciting milestone that will pave the way for a lot of different benefits to the Lightning Network. I will probably cover that in additional detail here in a video very soon. You also have the announcement of Strata, which is an EVM compatible validity rollup on Bitcoin. It's a lot of chunky words there, but it's built by Alpin Labs, who is doing some really trailblazing research on ZK or zero knowledge technology for Bitcoin. Be sure you're subscribed if you're in any way interested in new Bitcoin tech, because I think this is going to be one of the biggest themes, right? We've had this whole like kind of L2 season in Bitcoin, and a lot of these L2s are not really L2s, right? It's like deposit your Bitcoin into this multi-sig that I control, and then like I'm going to issue you this random other thing that has absolutely no tether of any kind to Bitcoin, right? So most of the Bitcoin L2s you have seen come out this year fall into that category. By the way, there's a very great resource that I've highlighted in the past called bitcoinlayers.org, where you can see some really great analysis on each of these layer 2s, and you can see how that compares to something like Lightning, which has unilateral exit, which some would argue is a critical requirement for an L2. But in any case, ZK technology is one of the really promising technologies that have been pioneered in other crypto ecosystems that, if we can bring it to Bitcoin, gives immense benefits no matter what kind of Bitcoin user you are. Whether it's privacy, additional functionality, and how we can hold Bitcoin in vaults and different things like that, payments, all sorts of different things. And so that's been exciting to see Alpin Labs now launch Strata. And I don't think I really covered this, but back in the summer, you had Bitcoin OS announce the first ever verification of a ZK proof on Bitcoin mainnet with no soft fork. That was not believed to be possible. So in many ways, we are pushing the envelope of what is possible on Bitcoin. And so I'm definitely going to do a deep dive video on these topics very soon. So be sure you're subscribed if you're not already. So that's an awful lot of good, right? On the macro front, on the adoption front, on the technology front. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows, and it never is. And as is often the case, the cloudy topic and category for this monthly digest is none other than on the regulatory front. And what this has to do with is new revelations and information about what actually happened in 2023 with all the kind of banking stuff in the US. As folks may recall, you had banks like Signature, SVB go down, and it would appear to be largely due to their own mismanagement of assets and liabilities and duration matching and all that sort of stuff, given the rapid pace at which the Fed increased interest rates. And there are some like Balaji that argued, well, even then they weren't kind of at fault because the Fed did this sort of unprecedented thing. But let's put those to the side, right? You could sort of say, okay, they went under and they probably should have. I think you could make that argument. Where that argument is less clear is in the curious case of Silvergate. So Silvergate at the time voluntarily liquidated, which is a highly, highly unusual and very rare event for a bank to do. And everyone sort of thought, okay, I guess that's the end of that. But at the time, folks may recall that Nick Carter was asking questions like, did the government start a global financial crisis in an attempt to destroy crypto? This whole Chokepoint 2.0, as it became known. I did a bunch of videos at the time on that. You can search on my channel around March or so, 2023. But what has now come out, what has now been revealed in the bankruptcy proceedings and through different sources that have now come forward, is that the Biden administration told Silvergate that it had to cap the deposits it had from, crypto companies and other entities at 15% or else. So Silvergate was one of the key, really two banks that was serving Bitcoin and crypto companies at the time, right? I'm a startup co-founder myself with our Bitcoin startup Jolts. And so like, I know how difficult this is and how important it is in this interim phase before hyper-Bitcoinization to still have some connectivity as a business to the fiat system and to the traditional banking system. The Biden administration comes out with this ultimatum behind the scenes, right? Not out in the open. And this was an impossible thing for Silvergate to do. Silvergate itself, if you look at their balance sheet health, could have and should have rode that storm just fine. But because of this arbitrary decree from the government, they were forced to liquidate and shut down their business. And arguably the bigger thing is that in part contributed to the more general panic around the banking system at that time. So the Biden administration, in an effort to choke off the Bitcoin and crypto industry from the traditional banking system, in many ways exacerbated the broader ills in the banking system at that time, and that in many ways have continued since then. So who knows what's going to come of all this? I don't think anyone listening to this is particularly surprised that the government would do such a thing, but it's just a stark reminder that we are still in many ways in the then they fight you phase. Despite all the cheerleading from the BlackRocks of the world, we should not lose sight of the fact that this is all still very under pressure. Regulators do not like this. They do not like Bitcoin. They do not want you to have self-sovereignty. And even all the sort of talk that, Trump's doing, and we're going to free Ross and we're going to do all of this stuff. Hopefully he follows through on a lot of these campaign promises, but make no mistake, right? Like, we should not be sort of cozying up to politicians and regulators who have historically only demonstrated the desire to see us die. But in any case, I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts of any of those topics that we discussed today? Let me know in the comments down below. But I hope you found this valuable and insightful. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like. Use the share feature underneath this video. That really does help get this to a wider audience. And if you were so enamored with this content, and you want to donate to a plug, which really does help me continue to make these videos, you can do so in a number of ways. There's the YouTube Super Thanks feature built directly into YouTube. Or if you want to zip some sats my way on the Lightning Network, you can send to my Lightning address, ragermajor@getalby.com. And lastly, for those of you that want to get in touch with me, I'm now working with a number of clients one-on-one on all sorts of topics, taking self-custody, creating a multi-sig, Bitcoin privacy best practices, running your own node, and more. You can reach out to me at vita.io/Ian Major. With all that, we'll go ahead and leave things here. As a reminder, every sat counts. And until next time, my friends, I'll see you then.